There is a very specific moment that happens inside an avoidant when silence replaces pursuit, and it is not what most people think. It is not indifference, not relief, and not control. It is the slow collapse of an identity they built around being the one who never needed more, suddenly confronted with the uncomfortable reality that they did. There is a very precise psychological moment that takes place within an avoidant individual. It is something most of them would never verbalize, rarely fully acknowledge even to themselves, and certainly never allow you to directly observe in real time. It unfolds quietly, deep inside the space your absence creates. At first, it does not happen. In the early phase of silence, their internal defense system is still active. In that stage, the avoidant mind tells itself familiar stories, that your distance is temporary, that you will eventually re-enter the cycle, that what is happening is just a brief disruption in a dynamic they already understand and feel in control of. Their emotional system leans on assumption, not reality. It expects repetition of the old pattern rather than the beginning of something new, but that only holds for a while. The shift begins later, when your silence does not resolve itself, when there are no follow-up messages, no emotional bids, no quiet attempts to reconnect, when days stretch without the usual pursuit from your side, and most importantly, when it becomes undeniable that you did not collapse back into the role they were accustomed to you playing. Instead, you chose yourself, fully, without announcement, without conflict, without drama. That is the point where something in them starts to fracture. And what follows internally is not simple emotional sadness or clean regret. It is something far more disorganized and psychologically layered, a kind of internal collision where multiple parts of their identity activate at once and begin pressing against each other with no clear resolution. Their pride reacts first, then shame surfaces underneath it, then longing appears, uninvited and inconvenient. Then anxiety begins to rise because the old system of control no longer applies. And beneath all of that is a deeper disruption, the attachment system trying to process a loss that was not delivered in a way it knows how to categorize. This is not a neat experience for them. It is not the kind of emotional clarity people like to imagine when they think of missing someone. It is tension, contradiction, and internal instability happening all at once. At the center of it is something they are not comfortable facing, the realization that they were not simply let go of, but quietly outgrown in behavior, and in that process, unintentionally humbled by your ability to disengage without chasing closure from them. That realization is where embarrassment enters the picture. And embarrassment in avoidant psychology is often underestimated. It is rarely discussed, yet it carries enormous weight in shaping their internal response after a relational shift like this. The avoidant typically builds a self-concept around emotional independence. A quiet internal narrative forms over time. They are the one who is less attached, less dependent, more self-contained, the one who can step forward or step away without being deeply affected either way. This identity is not always spoken. In fact, it rarely is. It is demonstrated through behavior instead, through delayed responses, emotional withdrawal, inconsistent availability, and the subtle positioning of themselves as someone whose connection is optional rather than necessary. Meanwhile, the other person in the relationship is often the one visibly reaching, expressing, adapting, and investing emotionally. That contrast reinforces the avoidant's internal story. It confirms their belief that they are not the one at risk of losing balance in the connection, but silence changes the entire structure of that belief. When you stop reaching, you remove the very foundation their internal narrative was standing on. There is no confrontation required, no emotional debate, no final argument that can be analyzed or dismissed, just a clean absence of pursuit. And in that absence, the old identity stops being supported by evidence. Now the dynamic no longer shows them as the less affected one. Instead, it shows something they were not prepared for, that the person they assumed would continue investing simply chose to stop, not out of anger, not out of manipulation, but out of clarity. And that is where the discomfort deepens. Because when someone who was emotionally engaged steps back with calm certainty, it forces a reevaluation that avoidant defenses are not designed to handle smoothly. It introduces a contradiction. If they were truly less invested, why does your absence feel like loss? If they were truly unaffected, why does your silence carry weight? This is where the internal collapse of certainty begins. Not an external collapse, but a private one, quiet, destabilizing, and difficult to name. The avoidant mind then oscillates between explanations. One part tries to dismiss it, another part tries to rationalize it, another part feels the pull of what was lost, but cannot fully integrate it into their self-image. This creates emotional fragmentation rather than resolution, and underneath all of it sits the most uncomfortable realization of all. Your silence did not come from neediness or reaction. It came from self-regulation, from choice, from boundaries they did not anticipate you would actually enforce. That is where the subtle humiliation lives, not in cruelty, not in revenge, but in the quiet demonstration that you were capable of stopping without breaking. And that is not something their old framework accounts for easily. Because in the original structure of the dynamic, they were meant to be the one with control over distance, the one who decides when closeness happens and when it does not. But your withdrawal disrupted that entirely. It introduced a form of agency they did not expect from you at that level. So what you end up seeing from the outside is silence. But on the inside, what unfolds is much more complex. A mixture of pride trying to protect itself, shame trying to surface, longing trying to be ignored, and a nervous system trying to reinterpret a story that no longer fits its original script. And the longer your silence continues, the more undeniable it becomes that something has changed permanently in the structure between you, not because of what you said, but because of what you stopped doing. And in that space, the avoidant is left confronting a version of reality they were never fully prepared to meet. The realization that your absence was not a reaction to them, but an act of self-return from you. What makes the avoidant's internal experience so destabilizing in this phase is a very specific and uncomfortable realization. The identity they built around being less attached, more self-contained, and emotionally self-regulated suddenly stops matching what they are actually feeling in real time. For a long time, that identity wasn't just a preference, it was a structure. It was the psychological scaffolding that allowed them to move through closeness without feeling consumed by it. It framed distance as strength, independence as superiority, and emotional restraint as proof of control. But when you remove the relational stability that once reinforced that self-image, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The nervous system starts registering signals that do not align with the story anymore. Instead of feeling unaffected by distance, they begin to feel it. Instead of experiencing separation as neutral, it starts to register as absence. And that shift creates internal dissonance. The mind still tries to operate from the old identity, while the emotional system is already reacting to a new reality it was never prepared to fully acknowledge. This is where fragmentation begins. Not dramatic, but quiet, like a slow misalignment between who they believed themselves to be and what they are now forced to experience without your presence. In that moment, the person who once relied on emotional distance as proof of control is left confronting something far more difficult to admit, an unmistakable sense of absence that behaves, internally, very much like need. Not the obvious or expressive kind of need that they may have judged in others before, but something more internalized and harder to metabolize, a pull toward connection that does not announce itself with language, but with discomfort. It shows up as mental preoccupation, as a subtle fixation on what is missing, as an inability to fully restore internal equilibrium even when life externally continues. What makes this especially destabilizing is that it does not fit their existing framework for self-understanding. If they defined themselves as independent, unaffected, and self-sufficient, then this emerging sense of something missing threatens the coherence of that identity. So the mind attempts to reinterpret it, downplay it, rationalize it, or compartmentalize it, but the body does not fully comply. There is a lingering activation that comes from the simple fact that emotional attachment was formed, whether acknowledged or not. And now that the source of that attachment is gone, the system does not immediately return to baseline. Instead, it searches, quietly, relentlessly, not for drama, not for conflict, but for regulation that used to come from your presence. That is where embarrassment takes root, not as a surface emotion, but as a private psychological rupture. It is the internal recognition that the narrative they depended on was incomplete at best and misleading at worst. The story of being the one who doesn't get attached, the one who can step in and out without consequence, begins to collapse under the weight of lived emotional evidence, because now they are not analyzing attachment from a distance. They are experiencing the after effects of it. And what intensifies this embarrassment is the contrast between expectation and outcome. They did not anticipate that your absence would carry this level of internal persistence. They did not anticipate that disengagement would not feel like freedom, but like unresolved tension. And most importantly, they did not anticipate that you would exit in a way that left no emotional leverage behind. No chaos to reinterpret, no conflict to reframe, no dramatic rupture to position themselves as justified in detaching. Just a clean absence that refuses to give their ego something to organize itself around. That lack of narrative access is what makes the experience so uncomfortable, because when there is no story to defend against, only reality remains. And reality, in this case, is that they were impacted more deeply than their identity allowed them to believe was possible. What intensifies that discomfort even further is how you handled your exit. There was no escalation, no emotional collapse, no repeated attempts to pull resolution out of someone who was already withdrawing, no performative ending that allowed the dynamic to dissolve through mutual chaos. Instead, there was precision, a quiet discontinuation that did not require permission, validation, or emotional permissioning from the other side. And psychologically, this creates a very specific kind of internal imbalance for them, because it disrupts the expected hierarchy of emotional influence. In their internal model of relationships, they may have assumed, consciously or not, that emotional volatility, pursuit, or unresolved tension would define the ending, that there would always be some form of reactive loop they could interpret, even if only internally. But your silence removes that entirely. It places the responsibility of meaning-making back onto them without offering the familiar structure of interaction to process it through. And what becomes particularly difficult is the comparison that arises afterward. Not just that you left, but that you left with coherence, with restraint, with a level of self-regulation that does not mirror the emotional fragmentation they may associate with loss. That contrast does not resolve quickly. It lingers as a silent reference point that challenges how they understood both you and themselves within the dynamic. From there, another layer begins to surface: anger. And this anger is often misunderstood if it is viewed in isolation, because it is not simply a reaction to losing access to a person. It is a reaction to losing a system of predictability. In many avoidant-leaning dynamics, there is an unspoken equilibrium that forms over time. Emotional distance is maintained, but relational continuity is assumed. The connection exists in a structured imbalance that feels familiar, even if it is not openly acknowledged. When you remove yourself cleanly from that structure, you are not just leaving the person. You are removing the framework that allowed them to remain emotionally unchallenged while still connected. And that disruption creates friction. The anger is not fully directed at you as an individual, nor is it fully self-directed. It sits in a suspended state, searching for justification. Because if they fully acknowledge what triggered it, they would have to confront the implication that your absence is a consequence of the dynamic itself, not an external violation of it. And that introduces discomfort that destabilizes their self-concept. So the anger circulates instead. It appears in flashes of irritation, in reinterpretations of your behavior, in attempts to mentally restore symmetry to something that no longer has it. And underneath both the embarrassment and the anger, something far more vulnerable begins to surface: grief. Not immediate, not obvious, and often not consciously labeled as such. It arrives indirectly, as a persistence of thought, as emotional restlessness that does not resolve through distraction, as a quiet recognition that something meaningful has been removed from their internal landscape. This is not necessarily grief for the relationship as it was, but grief for what the connection represented before it became defined by distance and imbalance. And this is precisely why it is difficult for them to fully access, because acknowledging grief requires acknowledging significance, and acknowledging significance requires acknowledging participation in its loss. So instead, it appears in fragmented ways, moments of reflection they do not verbalize, internal contradictions between missing and resisting, and an inability to fully categorize what they are feeling without destabilizing their preferred self-image. And in this space, your silence becomes something more than absence. It becomes a mirror. It does not create the emotional experience, but it reveals it without distortion. It strips away the noise of interaction, the back and forth that once allowed ambiguity to exist, and leaves behind only the internal reality they now have to sit with. That what they dismissed, minimized, or controlled away was not as inconsequential as they once believed. The avoidance relationship with grief is one of the most intricate and least visible parts of their psychological structure, because grief is never just about loss, it is about meaning. It requires the mind to admit that something mattered enough, that its absence creates impact, weight, and emotional consequence. And for someone whose internal identity has been organized around emotional self-sufficiency, that admission cuts directly into the foundation they rely on to understand themselves. To grieve is to acknowledge value, and to acknowledge value is to confront the possibility that the connection they minimized, distanced from, or slowly destabilized through inconsistency was never as optional as they told themselves it was. Not replaceable, not insignificant, not easily dismissed, but something singular. Your silence is what brings that reality into focus. Not because silence is used as a tool or strategy to trigger a reaction, but because silence removes everything that previously kept emotional avoidance in motion. As long as you were still engaging, still reaching, still participating in the familiar rhythm of connection and withdrawal, the avoidant had something to manage, something to interpret, something to regulate in real time. There was interaction to analyze, distance to calibrate, control to subtly maintain. But silence changes the structure entirely. Once your presence is no longer something they can intermittently access or unconsciously depend on, there is no longer anything to manage. No signals to decode, no emotional positioning to adjust, only absence. And that absence, unfilled and uninterrupted, begins to surface what constant interaction previously kept beneath the surface. Grief, not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually as the mind runs out of distractions to attach itself to. What follows is rarely linear. It is not a simple realization or a single emotional breakthrough. It is a gradual exposure to emotional material that the avoidant system is not naturally designed to hold in full intensity. And so the first instinct is almost always retreat, not toward closeness, but toward more distance. This is why, from the outside, their behavior can appear unchanged or even more detached after your silence. They may seem more withdrawn, more internally sealed off, more committed to self-reliance than ever before. But what looks like indifference is often the surface-level expression of internal overload, a form of psychological stabilization. Because when emotional intensity rises beyond what feels tolerable, the avoidant does not move toward processing it directly. They move toward reducing exposure to it. More distance becomes the temporary solution to internal overwhelm, but distance does not erase emotion. It only postpones confrontation with it. And so, after this initial defensive phase, something else begins to emerge. Not publicly, not loudly, but in fragments, in moments where the mind is no longer fully occupied. Early mornings, late nights, brief pauses in routine, situations that do not demand full cognitive engagement. In those gaps, memory returns without invitation, not generalized memory, but specific emotional memory, the tone of conversations, the sense of familiarity in certain interactions, the feeling of being understood in ways that were not easily replicated elsewhere, the quiet significance of being seen by you in moments where defenses were not fully active. And alongside those memories comes something harder to avoid, awareness of what was done with them, the distancing, the inconsistency, the withdrawal cycles, the emotional ambiguity that gradually shaped the trajectory of the connection. This is where avoidance begins to lose its protective simplicity. Because it is no longer just about managing closeness, it becomes about confronting consequence. And consequence is heavier than avoidance typically anticipates. This is the point where internal humility begins to form. not performative humility, not something expressed outwardly for resolution or reconciliation, but a private, often unspoken recognition that something meaningful was not handled with the level of care it required. That realization does not arrive as a single emotional event. It accumulates, slowly, quietly, persistently, until it becomes difficult to maintain the original narrative without contradiction. Now, it is important to return the focus to what your silence actually represents, independent of what it may be activating on their side. Because there is a tendency, especially in interpretations like this, to frame silence as strategy, as leverage, as emotional influence designed to provoke reaction. But the kind of silence that actually creates this kind of internal disruption is not born from calculation. It is born from depletion. From the moment where continued emotional investment no longer feels sustainable. From the point where self-abandonment in the name of connection becomes more painful than separation itself. That is not a tactic. That is a threshold. It is the moment where your internal system stops organizing itself around someone else's inconsistency and starts recentering around your own emotional integrity. And that shift changes everything. Because your silence is no longer a message directed at them. It becomes a statement of alignment with yourself. It communicates, without words, that your value is not theoretical, it is not conditional, it is not something that expands or contracts based on someone else's ability to recognize it in real time. It is stable and no longer negotiable. From the avoidant perspective, this is where the psychological impact becomes most complex. Because while their internal experience may include embarrassment, frustration, grief, and cognitive dissonance, there is also another layer that is less often acknowledged: recognition, a form of respect that emerges not from agreement or comfort, but from witnessing self-containment executed with consistency. Avoidant structures are often built around valuing independence, emotional autonomy, and self-regulation. But what they encounter in your silence is something they did not expect to face in equal measure, the same quality reflected back at them, but without inconsistency, without mixed signals, and without internal contradiction. Their version of withdrawal often comes with oscillation, closeness followed by distance, engagement followed by retreat. Yours does not. It resolves, and that distinction is not easily ignored, because it reframes the entire dynamic without needing explanation. No argument was required, no confrontation was initiated, no emotional escalation was used to force clarity, just a decision, followed by consistency. And in that consistency, something becomes undeniable. The connection ended not in chaos, but in clarity. You did not pursue, you did not plead, you did not turn emotional pain into leverage or confusion into attachment strategy. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that no longer reflected mutual emotional responsibility. And that act, quiet, contained, unembellished, communicates more about self-respect than any extended explanation ever could. For the avoidant, that is not easily forgotten, not because it is dramatic, but because it is structurally clean. It leaves no ambiguity to distort, no narrative loophole to hide inside, just the presence of someone who knew when to stop. And in the space left behind, both realities exist at once. On one side, their internal world continues to process contradiction, discomfort, and unresolved emotion. On the other, your silence remains exactly what it was at the moment it began, a complete return to yourself. In the end, your silence does not just end the dynamic, it exposes it. It strips away the avoidant's defenses, their narratives, and their sense of control, leaving them alone with what they tried not to feel: loss, accountability, and recognition of your value. And while they may never express it clearly, something in them is permanently changed by the fact that you didn't fight to be chosen. You chose yourself instead.